Reddit, when was a time when you had to hold in laughter and failed? I was in church a few years ago. It was a very serious stuffy church. Most of the congregation was in their 70s/80s. This was also the kind of church that warned all you not to come back if you caused any story of trouble. My friends and I were sitting in the back pew. It was time for a hymn. Hallelujah, praise Jehovah. We sang. Things were going okay. Then we got to the first refrain. To this day, we have no clue where this came from. The acoustics in room made it sound like she was everywhere, but this shrill church lady voice rose above all other voices in the sanctuary. Hallelujah, praise Jehovah. Guy friend on the end of the pew started giggling. The girl next to me was struggling, but she held fast. I was fine, but braced myself for the next repeat. Guy friend was too far gone the second time it happened and resorted to burying his face into the girlfriend's shoulder. He was laughing so hard, she was shaking. She slowly raised the hymnal in front of her face and started laughing. The pastor's kids who were sitting in front of us noticed and started laughing too. At this point, I lost it, doubled over in the hymnal. So there we were. 3 college kids and 5 children practically rolling in the back 2 pews. We are getting angry stares from a few of the older people in the church, and we still had 2 refrains to go. Finally the song ended. Guy friend had tears running down his face and he looked at us, excused himself, and left the sanctuary for the next 10 minutes. When he got back, we couldn't look at each other without setting off the chain again. The poor pastor's kids had to write lines for the rest of the service. I couldn't go back to that church for a while. When I did finally go back a few years later, guess what hymn they sang? Haven't been back to that church since. Middle of a meeting with very high level management, way above my pay grade to even breathe the same air as these people, but I had field level knowledge and experience that could prove invaluable to the discussion. Anyway, I'm sitting there in my grease-stained, muddy coveralls. I was not given notice beforehand to clean up, in a room full of men in suits, and I look around. I acknowledge that I'm the only grunt in the room. I also acknowledge that I'm younger than everyone else in the room by at least 15 years. And finally, I acknowledge that of the 40 or so people in the room, I'm the only female. And my head immediately went to this looks like the start of a weird porno, and I burst out laughing as the VP of the company was in the middle of a spiel about the increased rates of incidents causing injury in the workforce. I was riding with my buddy to see his grandparents. Before we get out of the car he turns to me and says, "Just an FYI, my grandparents can be intense people." So we get inside, yada yada yada, chit chat is going swell, when my buddy's grandmother comes in the room wearing her Oban slippers. She struts around, and in the middle of the conversation between my friend and his grandfather, I hear the familiar sound of 2 cheeks slapping each other as a breath of gastric wind replaces whatever sentence I was preparing to say next. Clearly someone had fetched it. It was there. That awkward tension sat in the air. And yet, no one spoke up. In fact, it seemed I was the only person unprepared for the methane breach from down under. My friend's grandfather just speaks and continues where he had left off. My friend follows suit. It was at this moment that the little old lady next to me had been the one to rip an ungodly faking powerhouse of a fetched through the household. So there I'm trying desperately to hold in my laughter for fear of embarrassing my buddy's grandmother. Unfortunately I do one of those snicker/snort things and I lose it. I had to excuse myself. Long story short, my friend says his grandparents ended up liking me after all. When I was 18 my great-grandmother passed away. I didn't know her or that side of my family very well. I'm closer to my father's side, which is significantly smaller than my mom's side. Because I didn't know many people at the funeral I was very uncomfortable and bored beyond words. I sat through the service quietly and respectfully, though. However, the moment after everyone came to pray over the casket, the gentleman leading the funeral said, "And that concludes today's service." Everyone began crying very loudly in complete unison. I'm not sure why I found it funny, but I did. I kept turning away from everyone to giggle silently to myself. My father pulled me away from the casket and began giving me these Altoid mints. I laughed every time I'd finished one, and he would hand me another. I finally asked, "Why do you keep feeding me mints?" he responded, to keep you from faking laughing. This did not help the situation, because I started laughing louder, and in turn made him laugh. I obviously got my sense of humor from him. My crying mother started yelling at us, which got us kicked out of the funeral. As soon as my dad and I got into the car, we started laughing uncontrollably. This event has become a big story between my friends and family, and I'm known as that asshole who laughs during funerals. I've not attended one since. My best friend and I had chemistry together in 11th grade. By this point in the school year, we had long been separated and sat at opposite corners of the classroom from each other, but our loophole was that our teacher hadn't forbidden us from teaming up for lab assignments. One day, we have a lab assignment and finish early. My friend finds a grease pencil and completely unravels it. Then I broke off the actual pencil part and wrote "we broke it" on the unfurled remainder. The next time we are in class, the teacher begins the class by slowly sauntering toward the back left corner of the class, where my friend sat, as she says, "Now I know it wasn't anyone in this class." I'm already starting to giggle, and as she reaches the spot behind my friend's desk, continues, "But someone broke one of my grease pencils," and puts her hands on his shoulders. He's faking struggling, and I'm crying with my head buried into my desk. I honestly don't even remember what she said after that. I just know that we didn't get in any trouble. My roommate in college had a bad situation with this. He was sitting in class and he was half paying attention. A kid in his class was doing a presentation, and during it he said, "And my sister is like retarded." Half paying attention, my roommate thought he was making a joke about his sister and calling her stupid. He laughed real hard out loud and was the only one to do it. The kid was telling the class about his mentally handicapped sister, and I guess he didn't really know how to word it to the class. The teacher gave a death stare toward my roommate and he shut his mouth, but he couldn't stop laughing. He was uncontrollably letting out those sort of spit laughs that are forced through closed lips. The kid stopped his presentation and forcibly asked my roommate to stop laughing. He was so embarrassed when he came back to the room that he was debating dropping the class, and he had like a 4.03 of the way through. I was sitting in a courtroom for an assignment I had to do at the time. Basically we just had to observe the whole court procedure and all the rest. Now obviously courtrooms are super strict, and as an observer you have to be so silent you're almost non-existent. The judge was recapping what the defendant had done, and what he meant to say was, "You assaulted the two officers when they tried to subdue you." But he faked it up, and instead what he actually said was, "You assaulted the officers when they tried to seduce you." Easily the most painful 20 minutes of my life, trying to stifle my laughter and not completely lose my absolute shit. A friend of mine sat next to me, and she had tears streaming down her face. We couldn't look at each other. It was the most magical and terrifying moment of my life. Both times were at my undergrad college roughly 8 years ago. The first time, I think, was during an English course of maybe 10 students when one of the male students walked in with a fairly obnoxious large scarf draped around him. I think it was the way he walked, with his chest poking out, that set me off. I couldn't help but start laughing. Nonetheless, the female who sat next to me started laughing too. I kept trying to hold it in, but we started feeding off each other. At some point I had my face on the desk and was turned toward her, and we were both looking at each other laughing our ass off. I eventually excused myself. The other time was in my finance class, and it had to do with how my professor said something. She had this really feminine, innocent quality in her voice, and the way she stated something just set me off. Same deal as before. I eventually had to leave the room. Later I apologized to her in her office. On another note, I was eventually teamed up with a student from that class in a semester-long project, and that was brought up. She said she thought I was crying. Edit. Forgot to mention the time a mentally handicapped person and his caretaker, I assume father or grandfather, he was fairly elderly compared to him, but shrug, walked into a Burger King. He kept hooting and hollering, standing up and down. He eventually stared right at me and yelled some indistinct noises. I knew I shouldn't have been laughing, but it kept going on. Eventually I got up and left as I felt really bad, but that shit was funny, yo. TLDR, my mom accidentally backed over an outdoor cat of ours a few years ago and described its death as a callous family joke, and my dad and I failed so hard at containing our laughter. At dinner tonight, we were talking about one of my mom's outdoor cats and my dad made a joke about it being so overweight it couldn't clean itself properly. My mom follows with, well, that wasn't the worst thing that happened to it. That would be when I backed over it. She said it in such a sullen tone that my dad and I used everything we had to not burst out laughing. It happened a while ago, and the reason she ended up backing over it is because she spoiled it to the point where she would stop her car, move it, and then drive/park during its lifetime. Just not this one time. Then, my father recounts when she came in to tell him about the incident, and he just said badump, badump. We lost it. We have a long-time family joke about running over the outdoor animals because my mom would always worry when we'd go somewhere and tell my dad to watch out for them every time, and my father is a smart, attention-detailed man, so when we would start to pull out of the driveway as I was growing up, someone would always go badump, badump, and then she described it that way. We started crying, we were laughing so hard tonight. My poor mom. I should preface this story by telling you that 1. My family is very close, and 2. My husband is a first responder, and as such, we have all developed a twisted sense of humor. It's required to survive in his line of work. He's hilarious. In 2014 my husband and I found out halfway through the pregnancy that our firstborn, a son, had developed in the womb without all his organs, a fatal condition. Instead of preparing a nursery, we spent the second half of pregnancy making funeral decisions. I carried him 42 weeks, having to be induced at the hospital. The hospital waiting room was packed with good friends. 3 days later we had a great side service with about 150 people coming to support and love on us. I get up and speak about all the things we'll miss out on, all the firsts, all the memories, but that we are forever changed because of him. 3 Then I sit down in the front row between my sister and mom, while husband talks about how he's been changed. As he gets done, he steps to the side and our pastor asks us all to bow our heads in prayer. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is ugly crying. The pastor begins, and about 10 seconds in, husband comes over to bend in front of me, so we can hold hands as we say the last prayers of the service. As he squats down, we four, sister, me, mom, and hubs, hear this RIP as his pants split down the seam. We are at my son's funeral and absolutely doubled over, trying to stifle our laughter. I cringe at what the pastor must have been thinking, but we all agreed that our son 1 knew we needed a break from the sobbing and 2 inherited his father's hysterical sense of humor. Let me prepare this by saying I'm a theater nerd and a bit of a film snob, as are my other siblings. My brother and Sil are in town. It's their last night here, and they like to stay up late so they can sleep on their 6-hour plane flight home. We decided to go see a movie, and since it's opening night of Les Miserables, we'd take my mom and best friend out to go see it. I'm not enjoying it. I know a lot of people liked it, that's cool. But I hated it. The camera work was atrocious. The scenic and costume design would have been overblown in a stage show, let alone a film, and I can tell my entire group is feeling the same way. So, we are all sitting here, rolling our eyes, and making mental notes of problems in the movie, when we get to Anne Hathaway's death scene. Now, admittedly, she's the best part of the movie, but, even so, not a huge hurdle to cross there. But suddenly everyone, and I mean everyone in the theater, starts crying. And I don't mean dignified crying, but full-on snotty, heaving crying. I make the mistake of looking over at my brother and he's chuckling to himself. I start laughing quietly, which makes my friend and Sil start laughing quietly. Mom, in the middle, is shooting us dirty looks, which only makes it worse. Soon we're all sitting there, tears streaming, trying to hold it together and not guffaw like sociopaths, while Fantine is busy dying of consumption. Then the guy behind us starts, I don't know how to describe it, whimpering, I guess. Just this long, sustained, high-pitched keening noise that just keep going and going. All of a sudden, mom's death glare twists and she's desperately trying to keep her disapproval going, but the whimpering is winning out. We were also grateful when the innkeeper and his wife showed up, so we could let loose. I think the whole theater thought we were as into it as they were. Little did they know. This probably belongs in r/AMI the as whole, but last year I took a creative writing course. For the last day of class the prof asked us all to bring in a short story we liked. Most people brought in one that took 3 to 5 minutes to read out. This one girl decided to read her short story from a previous assignment. These usually lasted about 4 to 6 pages in length. So she reads aloud her short story. It was like Norman Barton level of bad. It was a love story about a girl picking between Marcello, her childhood friend and musician, versus Fabian, a horseback riding muscle boy. The equivalent of an erotic Twilight knockoff. She was reading this for about, no exaggeration because I began timing it, 22 minutes. It was not helped by her monotone voice as she read aloud her dialogue. So about 10 minutes into I started to smile at some of the silly lines, and I had just realized how far this was going to on for. I was sitting across from a friend, let's call him Alex. We pretty silently noticed we were on the same page with how silly this was, and we made little childish giggles at one another. We both knew she probably thought very highly of this piece, but that sort of just made the giggling worse. Eventually I started to laugh at the 15-minute mark. I had to leave the room. Me and another guy were laughing about it in the bathrooms until we came back 5 minutes later. She was still going. I truly hope she didn't hear me. I know I'm an absolute douche for laughing at something someone cares about, but it truly was that terrible. Yeah, I know, glass houses and such. But I couldn't help but throw a stone. Okay, so I'm getting my master's in education and unfortunately some of the classes are a fat faking joke. I'm sitting with some of my buddies as we walk into class and the professor asks us to respond in any way that feels true to us in our hearts and in any language we feel comfortable with. To the sentence starter, the first day of school said a lot about my scholastic life to come. Apparently, out of all 40 of us, only my BFF, and I interpret this as a creative writing exercise. So all these teachers are pouring their hearts into these real life accounts about their experiences in the education system, whereas my friend writes this absolutely ridiculous response in about 5 minutes. I kinda glance over and tell him he has to volunteer to read it, so he volunteers to read first in front of the entire class. I've actually never tried so hard to keep quiet in my life, but I just could not handle it. I was spitting and coughing and choking the entire time with the few other people in class who realized it was a joke. Somehow, most of the class plus the professor did not pick up on his creative stylings. I made him ML it to me. The first day of school said a lot about my scholastic life to come, because it was exemplary of the life I was going to live for the next 2 years. There were assignments stacking up, new courses I didn't know I had to take, and new faces everywhere I went. This led me to give up on scholastic life and to become a transient. The road was my woman, and she was fierce. Rainy days spent hitching up the Pacific Coast Highway was how I spent that October. I met a man named Tommy. I lost my fingernails gambling. I've only been gone for a month and I feel like I'm in my 60s. 2 nights ago, I saw a picture of my friend in the newspaper. He had just discovered some molecule or something, and his face was all over everywhere. I had met him that first week of school, name being David. Never thought David would amount to much. Always had his head in a book and now his face was in the paper. I missed old David, could have been him in another life. But that first day of school was too much for me. Scholastic life wasn't made for men like me, nor for people like you. We have too much that stops us from digging down and centering ourselves in the mundane. My lady, the fierce asphalt of the highway, she keeps me clean. She keeps me motoring on towards that great Valhalla in the north we call Canada. Afterwards some girl asked if he did an exchange program in Canada in high school and that was the nail in the coffin. I had to leave the room. I often airdrop people who have their settings set to public this picture. I try to see if I can pick out exactly who it is that is the lucky receiver. I'm in class one day before we started, but everyone is in their seats and talking to each other. I pull up my airdrop and am looking at making someone's day just a little bit more cheaty. I send it to the first one I see. Random my phone. I watch, without being obvious, to see if it gets accepted and if I can pick out who it was. Yes, they accept it. A few moments later, the professor exclaims, very loudly, that whoever did it is a very twisted individual, and it wasn't funny. No one knows what the hell she's talking about, but the reaction made me start chuckling. Not loudly, but enough that it was noticeable when everyone got quiet. I faking sold myself out, because I couldn't keep the laughter to myself 0/10. Would not recommend, if you can't control your laughter. Professor hates me, and we'll see how finals go this week. My so and I were with our group of friends and they invited this dude who we didn't really know well. This dude was a vegan. He kept saying how he didn't really drink as the majority of us were drinking, and he decided to partake. He got way too drunk way too quickly, and started laughing at children's cartoons on the TV, as in he grabbed the cable remote, and changed it to a children's channel. About half hour later he hit the depressive state, and started crying about, well, nothing really. He would jump from topic to topic and I don't really remember any of them except for the topic of being vegan. He told us through sobs that his dad made him shoot a rabbit during a hunting trip when he was really young, but he made it seem like the most dramatic thing in the entire world. He would quote his dad saying like, do it, if you wanna be a man just do it. I couldn't. He was making it seem too much like a movie, and while I don't disagree, that must have been traumatic for him. I bust out laughing, and immediately after my so also burst out laughing. Our friends got kinda mad at us, and I felt real bad, but it was just too damn funny. I work at a shooting range. Our target backers are sheets of cardboard with 2 clothespins superglued to them, and that hangs from a metal hanger attached to the wire. People shoot the clothespins all the time, and instead of going through the motions of replacing the backer, we hand them a clothespin and tell them to just clip it to the side of the cardboard to pin the target onto it. I handed a clothespin to a gentleman who had just gone into the range to find out that the previous customer in that particular lane had somehow shot the clothespin's front half off, leaving just the back half that was still glued to the cardboard. I told him just to clip that one to the side, and about 2 or 3 minutes later, my boss comes to me and asks me to go into the range and show this fellow how to clip a clothespin onto the edge of a piece of cardboard. When I got into the range, I went into the lane to see that the guy and his friend had disassembled the new clothespin I gave him and were attempting to use the parts of it repair the remaining half of the original clothespin. I felt bad for doing it, but I laughed so hard that people in other lanes stuck their heads out to see what was so funny. I returned to the lobby to retrieve a new pin and went back in the range to show them that they could simply have clipped it to the side, and one of them turns to the other and says, "And you're an engineer." I was in a class where I had to research what a zero energy home is, and I came across this website. I spent the next hour and a half going back and forth looking at all the mistakes, which include metal panels dark color, which is actually the search term I used to find it again, when sun shines too low, scarcity of hot water comes, and my personal favorite, the electric department is amazed to see that the electric meter starts running backward. In fact, you can tell your utility companies to pay you is something extraordinary. I must have been sleep deprived because I didn't stop laughing for the entire hour and a half. I was at the back of the class, and I distinctly remember at least one person turning around and getting the giggles just looking at me. At the time I thought it was because the laughter itself was funny, but I now realize it's probably because my face was red as a beet. I was doing personal taxes on the side for some extra income. The AC unit for my office was broken, and the repair company had installed indoor mobile units. Sometimes they would make a burning plastic smell that would quickly fade. We get this young kid who works in the fast food industry. He lost his W-2. The woman who is helping this young man is in her late 60s. I get called over to work some magic and see if I can find his W-2 off the payroll company's website. Prior to me walking over, I thought I had caught a whiff of marijuana. Once I was at her computer, I was certain I was smelling marijuana. This kid thought it was a good idea to blaze before getting his taxes done. As I'm on the web to find his W-2, the older woman starts asking me if I can smell that. I play dumb and say, "Smell what?" I look at this kid, and he is getting a little nervous. She won't let it go though. She is dead set that it is the air conditioners. I look back at this kid. He knows that I know. I smile a little and turn back around. Older lady won't shut up about it though. She is freaking out that the ACK units are going to catch fire. She whips out her phone and calls the owner. She asks me to describe the smell. I'm biting my tongue. I just kind of take a step back and shrug. Fast food kid is sweating bullets. The lady starts calling other employees over to ask them to describe the smell. None of them can describe it. We have 4 other employees, all older than 60, crowded around this kid taking in huge whiffs. At this point I think they are all pranking this kid, but no. They have no idea that it is the kid. I had to walk away. As I'm walking back to my desk I see a young couple, abandoned by their preparer. They are just dying. Trying so hard not to laugh. I'm trying not to laugh. We make eye contact, and it's done. We all break out laughing. The fast food kid can't take it, and just books it out of the office. One of the old guys sniffing around thinks the kid left, because the smell was making him sick. They all start to feel bad for the kid. We only laugh harder at this point. The old people think that we are just having a good time a couple desks down. They ask us what's so funny, then scold us about how serious this problem is. The next day the owner had a memo about turning off the ACK units if they start to produce a skunk-like smell. Oh boy, so I've got one. I was eating in the local bar at my parents' town and the local high school basketball team was playing in their sectionals for state. Now, if you've ever lived in a small town, you understand how important state is. If you haven't, let me attempt to frame it for you. Imagine someone from your city going to the Olympics. Win or lose, you bet your sweet as there's gonna be a parade or two for this individual. As such, everybody in town was packed in this poor little bar with a computer hooked up to the only TV. I, being the giant nerd that I am, could care about this game, but the atmosphere in this little building was insane. The bar was cheering and going nuts at every single play, even though the stream the bar was using was stuttering along. As the game got to the final seconds with our town's team down by 1, the team got fouled upon. These free throws would mean their ascension into finals. As the kid lines up for the shot, I elbow my brother in the shoulder and say, out loud, cue the stream crashing in 3.2.1. And it faking happens as the kid takes the shot. Everyone is either screaming or shell shocked. Well, expect for me. I have my head buried in my arms, crying my eyes out in tears of laughter. I remember thinking to myself, this is how I die. By a mob of angry 60 to 70-year-old sports fans. Luckily, I was able to make it out of there while avoiding many evil glares. I haven't set foot in there yet and I have no plans on doing so in the near future. Edit, typos and clarifications. Probably will be buried, but whatever. I'm currently pursuing a course which has specialized subjects that the strength of the students is only in single digits. This particular class had a strength of 4 people including myself. The subject was quantitative aptitude, basically fancy math, and we were solving problems like usual. Suddenly the professor decided to go off on a tangent and start talking about our purpose in life. Myself and another girl raised our eyebrows like what the fuck, and continued with our work. Meanwhile he progressed to talk about communism and praised it, effectively deriding democracy simultaneously. We had no choice but to listen to it as we worked. Except this other dude in our class. He decided that he had no facts to give on that day and proceeded to lay his head down and go to sleep. Might I remind you guys that we were only 4 students in an awfully silent class where you can hear the tummy rumbling sounds. He drifted off as the professor was talking. Absolutely no regard for him. And he proceeded to snore. It was so sonorous that it reverberated around the room. And the professor was absolutely not bothered and ranted his heart out. It was so awkward that it was funny. I couldn't fathom the scene before my eyes. Here, the professor passionately talking about communism, and his student, snoring away to glory. What initially started out as a snicker, evolved into full-blown laughter, as the professor was talking. I think he gave me the stink eye, but I was busy laughing to notice. Eventually I apologized to him for laughing in his face. He chalked it up to differences in our political opinion. But man, it was hilarious watching him talk with the snores overpowering his voice. My Mill is extremely difficult to talk to. I don't think she actually knows how to have a conversation, but I know she means well. She was at my house yesterday. I was about to get dressed, but didn't know what to wear. Conversation went as follows. Me, is it warm outside? Mill, I'm always warm, cause I'm overweight. See. Me, but it is warm outside? Mill, I'm losing weight though. Me, I just want to know what to wear. Mill, don't forget to wear sun cream, even if it's cloudy. Me, but is it warm outside? Mill, my mom had skin cancer 5 times. So and I couldn't help but burst out laughing. I just wanted to know if I should wear shorts. Mill's mom is still alive by the way. I told her it didn't matter and went upstairs. Heard so explain why we were laughing. Mill joined in laughing and shouted it's warm. I live in Sweden and this was back in secondary school. We had one of those mandatory classroom activities where the local police would visit us, tell us about their jobs, about the law, how to handle emergencies, warn us about drugs etc. During the later part, they had a Q&A session and another classmate asked them about breathalyzers and specifically how sensitive they were. The policeman told us that they were very sensitive and could even register candy that contained trace amounts of liquor, such as rum pralines. When he said that, I got this vivid mental image of some poor fellow getting arrested and hauled away kicking and screaming by the police after eating something as ridiculous as a rum praline. I involuntarily started giggling. Other classmates turned to look at me and this made me giggle even more. The policeman stopped talking, turned his head, and looked at me with a puzzled look as if he couldn't decided if I was some kind of half-wit or if he had accidentally said something funny. By this point my body was rocking and heaving from barely contained laughter and tears were rolling down my cheeks. The final straw was the teacher who stepped up with a stern look at her face and I just broke down and began roaring with laughter. The teacher told me to leave the classroom and not come back until I had recovered my senses. I stumbled out in the class hall and stood there for several minutes, giggling like a madman while wiping tears from my eyes. Not me, but my brother's friend. So at our high school, like many schools run a debating competition. Both me and my brother have been in the team for our respective year levels. He's 2 years older than me. One round, my brother's team was debating against another school's team in the grand finals of the competition. They were the senior team that year, all year 12s, and were determined to win. One of the speakers on the other team had a really high-pitched voice. His voice was more high-pitched than most girls' voices. Because it was the grand final, a bunch of my brother's friends had shown up to support him and his other friends on the team. It also meant that the principal showed up as well. So the high-pitched voice guy gets up, and everyone but my brother's friends had seen this guy debate before. We were all prepared to suppress laughter. He starts speaking, and my brother's friends sitting in front of me started giggling. About 1 minute through they can't control it. One of them lets out an audible laughter and tries to apologize through the laughing fit. The other friends can't contain themselves and all start laughing with each other. Everyone else is silent. Except the principal. He was furious. He gets up and grabs one of them by the arm and commands the others to follow. He tries to leave the classroom, but the door won't budge. He pulls at the handle, but it won't move. He tries again and nothing. In anger, he kicks the door to see if it will go the other way. The door flies off its hinges and crashes into the railing behind it. Not even caring, the principal walks these boys out and gives them detention on the spot, and the debate is called off, with our school's team forfeiting. Okay, this is long, but anyway, we used to play a lot of Oblivion, computer game, in our house. My partner was leveling up his block skill by standing next to a mud crab and letting it bounce off his shield. Mud crabs are a very weak enemy, but they do a tiny bit of damage each hit, and my partner wasn't paying attention. He ended up getting killed by one of the weakest monsters in the game. Our kids thought this was hilarious and used to tease him about it all the time. My daughter, Jay, was about 7, and someone had a class Christmas party, so we went along. I ended up sitting with some other mums I didn't really know. They were talking about shopping or their nails or something, and I just really wanted to go. But Jay's having a great time running around with her friends, so I just sat there. After a bit, she comes up to me with a little boy in tow. The boy says to me, disbelievingly, "Did Jay's dad really get killed by a mud crab?" I know that other kids at school were familiar with Oblivion, and I figure they have been talking about the game. I kinda laugh. "Yeah, he did. Pretty lame, huh?" The boy looks at me in complete horror, his lip quivering, and says in an anguished voice, "If my dad died, I wouldn't laugh. I'd be crying." Whoops, he thinks it's real. I catch my daughter's eye, and she is grinning away, oblivious. I was absolutely about to crack up laughing, but I really could not do that to this poor kid. I buried my face in my hands to hide my expression. I was trying to hold back gales of laughter, but it came out as kind of choking sobs. I was gasping for breath, so as not to laugh in the little boy's face. After a minute or so, the other parents started to notice that I'm apparently head in hands, crying my eyes out. I could hear their discomfort and rising tension, murmuring to each other, "I don't know, I think her husband died? Something about shellfish? Analogy? I'm not sure." Of course this just made me laugh more. One of them eventually asks me if I'm okay. Her reluctance to get involved was palpable. That seems even funnier to me. I get up and stagger away, because there is no way I'm going to be able to explain this. 8th grade, I was an officer in my school's junior beta club, and we were inducting the new 6th graders. There's this kid that's been bothering me for most of the year during car rider pickup. Huge guy, thick glasses, bowl cut, and probably some serious issues. Apparently I was his boyfriend for a month at one point, and me and a few buddies loved to meds with him by getting him to go over and talk with all the super preppy girls for the laughs. So the head of the club is calling out everyone's names to come get their certificate. I hadn't seen this guy in the crowd, but his name was called, and he starts walking toward the stage with his usual goofy stare. I'm not handing out the certificates, so I'm sitting on the stage right next to where everyone comes up. He comes up, and I've been smirking his whole way up here. I let out an audible giggle, and he looks at me. Afterwards the guy that sat next to me says he heard it too. Thankfully the head of the club never found out, but this haunts me to this day. I was too mean to him, and he deserved better. I hope he's doing my better these days. Many years ago, when I was a little kid, we had religious Catholic class in school, back then where this was a thing. And as was normal as well, the religion teacher was also the priest of our town's church. Very Catholic etc. etc. The teacher was a very strict, humorless man. We had teachers in school where you could fool around and it was no big deal, but he was one of those where the kids were really afraid of. One day, this strict conservative Catholic priest/religion teacher came up with what he likely thought was extremely cool and progressive, that we, a class full of 35 fucking teenagers, should meditate. Meditate, as in, sitting in silence for like 20 minutes. So as we meditate, the teacher shows pictures of Jesus etc. Me and my mate I shared the desk with, we were already close to explosion. We tried to hold in the laughing as good as we could. The fact that the teacher was so strict and that laughing would be really, and I mean really bad, didn't help things. It just made things worse. I avoided to look at my desk mate because I knew he was right before bursting out laughing, and so was I. So he took a pen, put it in his mouth and bit on it, in desperation to contain his laughter. I did too. We both bit pens, while the teacher in front held up his Jesus pics and tried to keep the class sitting in absolute silence. At some point I think we just couldn't hold it anymore, and we started bursting out laughing, and the teacher got very mad. I don't remember more, it's so long ago. We probably got written up or something. I've got one. At the point of this story I was an EMT basic going through advanced EMT school on my way to paramedic. Me and my partner were training a new hire medic, pretty standard to have them ride third to help them learn our charting system, area, and observe how they interact with patient/hospital staff. We get dispatched to a drug rehab facility for a difficulty breathing chief complaint. We get on scene quick. Patient doesn't appear to be in any distress. He was a darker individual, so our normal visual indicator of cyanosis is kinda difficult to see on this fellow. Well, initial vitals, his pressure is normal to high 150s/90s, pulse 110, O2 sat 90% with an okay waveform. So we load him up, apply oxygen with a nasal cannula. Oxygen saturation comes up to 93 on 2 liters. The guy is now saying he feel tightness in his chest. We start thinking maybe this is cardiac related. ECG looked fine. So my 2 partners do a 12 lead and prep for an IV 12 lead. Doesn't show anything saying it might be cardiac, but we transmitted it anyways. The new hire wanted to attempt a very small IV through this guy's track marks. My partner tells her get something bigger, because if this guy crashes we would need it to be a great line. She attempts an 18, gets it, but it's hard to flush. It looks and feels fine according to my partner, just hard to flush fluid through, which can be normal, could be a valve at the end of the cath, it can still be used. Well, this guy does indeed crash. He starts having a heart attack. I was just an EMT at this point, I had zero ECG training, so I don't know what they saw or didn't see. We get to the ER a few minutes after compressions are started. I take over compressions once we get him onto the ER bed. Nurses try to run fluid through the line the new hire started, and it wasn't working, so they opt to start their own. They find that almost impossible, so the doctor orders an IO/femoral line, possibly both. At this point the doctor is attempting to intubate the patient. The nurses cut this guy's pants off so they can do the above mentioned interventions, so they can start pushing drugs. Well, unbeknownst to us, the years of recreational drugs this man had taken had given him some erectile dysfunction. So to fix that, he had one of those penis pumps implanted, the ones where the pump is where the testicles are at. Well, somehow during compressions the pump was triggered, and when they cut this dude's pants off, of course he wasn't wearing boxers/underwear. Our pops is 3/4 of the way erect down. This thing had to be every bit of 11 inches, but the kicker, it was super thin. Imagine an actual drumstick. Remember the doctor at the head of this patient trying to intubate? Well, he looks up and cold as ice says, "Huh, that's probably the biggest dick I've seen today." This catches us all by surprise. The nurses chuckle as much as you can while trying to save a man's life. But me, I faking lose it. Luckily it was my turn off the chest. I excuse myself and finish laughing as I clean the stretcher. I guess it was just how calmly the doctor made the comment while trying to intubate this man. In case you were wondering, they did get pulses back, but the family ended up pulling him off life support day later. Remember, don't do drugs. TLDR, while performing chest compression on a patient, his implanted penis pump activates and is flopping around as we compress this gentleman's chest. Quickly followed up a comment from the doctor coolly saying, "That's the biggest dick I've seen today." This combination of events caused me to lose my sheet and go collect myself as I cleaned the gurney and put the truck back together. When I was 6, we took a family road trip from San Diego to a little podunk town south of Little Rock to visit friends of my parents. The friends of my parents had 2 kids who weren't particularly well behaved because their parents would go from all is good to DEFCON 1 yelling at them. One day my mom asked me to do something, and apparently I didn't have a quick enough for the correct response, and she yelled at me similar to her not so great at parenting friend. 6-year-old me noticed the difference, and I said something like, "You wouldn't yell at me like that if we weren't here around them. You'd just tell me you didn't like me not paying attention, and then I'd say I'm sorry and do better at paying attention to you." Well, this was a little too much truth from her child, and I could see that she had been embarrassed by what I'd said. But imagine my surprise when she grabs the but paddle, a broken paddle ball paddle with a piece of the wood missing to leave a nice crease on your behind. She'd never paddled me before. Fucking peer pressure. /u/Mac blast off. Come here. I was commanded by mom. Uh-oh, trouble. I did as I was told and knew a hoop-in as her friend called it was coming. So I turned around, braced myself, but I knew something mom didn't. I had a secret weapon. That summer, I had taken up collecting rocks. I happened to have a number of flat skipping stones I had found at the creek near their house, all inventoried and stored in my back pockets, providing me a nice layer of armor. I knew I'd have to use my best acting skills to pull it off. So when the first swing of the paddle landed, it sounded much louder than the force of the swing would have normally generated. 6-year-old me panicked and upped the reaction, commensurate with the sound of the impact. The second smack was just as loud, as was I. My mom was getting irritated at me overplaying the pain in front of her friend, so she put more into the third swing and connected. A sound like gunfire resounded as the paddle literally split over my backside, my Stone Age armor having been slightly too effective at protecting me from any real harm. Realizing she had broken the paddle over my mineral-lined ass, I really started crying and caterwauling, which confused her, because she hadn't really put so much into it to break the paddle, and b, something seemed off to her. I was dutifully rubbing my cheeks when she said, "Come here a minute," and I took off, laughing. The jig was up. She's chasing me around the island in the kitchen, laughing too. I'm fainting left, then right, but eventually she catches up, and, with the remainder of the paddle, swats me between the pockets, giving me a real swat that wasn't funny anymore. That's for lying to me. I just stared at her defiantly after that, and I think she knew she overdid it to the point of me seeing her differently, as fallible. And if she starts on me nowadays about being too strict with my kids, whom I've never paddled, merely used increasing consequences, all I do is ask her if she's seen any decent rock collections lately, and she backs off. So worth it, having that story in my back pocket. I was a freshman in high school, and there was this Squamish youth leadership thing that my parents wanted me to be a part of. We went through with it, but I hated every minute of it. One day, we were sitting in the little auditorium we normally had met in, listening to our peers give their ideas for a fundraiser for some random charity around our community. Real engaging stuff. Out of the corner of my eye, across the aisle, I see a small downward movement. I look over to see a big guy sitting in his chair with the most mortified expression, unsure of what was about to happen. Time stood still, like everyone in the room held their breaths. The chair's cushion completely snapped off, and Tubby McGee went careening to the floor, landing with about 3 seconds of residual jiggle. No one else in the room saw it. I was the lone witness to the #1 funniest faking thing to ever happen in my town. I could not stop laughing. I would think the worst of it was over, but I'd replay it in my head again, and voila, I was cackling like a maniac. My girlfriend next to me was shushing me, telling me I'm an asshole, but to no avail. To this day, possibly the funniest sheet I've ever seen in person. My junior or senior year in high school, we had a really strict conservative American history teacher, and had to have weekly notebook checks in front of the class. This class was insanely boring, so my buddy and I were always trying to think of ways to entertain ourselves. Our latest activity was to unroll the wire in our spiral notebooks to make little hawks and grab each other's stuff while we weren't paying attention. I was up at the podium with my teacher getting my notebook checked when I see my buddy trying to hawk my bag and drag it across the floor. He was so serious and determined. Then my teacher saw him, put down my notebook, and stared at him for probably the better part of a full minute. Now this was a dead silent class, no talking, no music, no videos playing. I had to stand next to my teacher as he stared at my unknowing friend trying to MacGyver his way into my bag, while it was making a loud dragging noise across the carpet. I was stifling my laughter for so long that I had a lone tear sliding down my cheek at this point. My teacher stared at me and asked if I knew what my buddy was doing, and I denied it, like a liar. Teacher yelled at my buddy, and we had to switch seats for the rest of the semester. Students made teacher cry because they all refused to make eye contact with her and ignored her entirely. I was the only one participating and engaged. The teacher left the classroom crying, and the principal walked in with school security and a couple of cops. He starts yelling at all of us, telling us how sweet our teacher is and how bad we are for making her cry. The girl behind me starts choking with her own saliva and begins to cough uncontrollably, which catches all of our attention. Then one of the security guards, an old Hispanic lady, yells, "Hey you, stop coughing," as if she had any control over it. The entire classroom breaks out in laughter, which only infuriated the principal even more. He yells at us to be quiet, and his voice was so loud and full of anger that the girl stopped coughing and everyone stopped laughing. Everyone but me. He points at me and tells me to be quiet. I laugh even more uncontrollably and try to hide my face. I rest my head on the table, wrapping my arms around my face to cover the laughter, but my body continued to jerk uncontrollably from the laughing. He commanded me to step out of the classroom and the 2 cops that were waiting outside went all boot camp on me, and from afar the teacher came running in to defend me saying that I was not the problem and that I was one of her best students. Lol. Working summer camp last year, and I had the worst case of forbidden giggles. It was a Christian camp, so each morning we'd have worship with a chaplain from the area. This particular chaplain was so well liked that a lot of the kids called her Mother X, despite us being Episcopalian and not really doing the whole forgive me father, for I have sinned thing. She was a sweetheart and generally a fun presence to have at camp. We start by her telling a story from the Bible, and it's all about how God protects us, even when we are full grown adults, because we are his children. And then she says, God is your heavenly daddy. He takes care of you. He's the best daddy in the whole world. I lost it. My counselors in training lost it. The staff member in charge of Christian formation, wholesome, wouldn't say boo to our goose type, wept with laughter. Even the camp director's shoulders were shaking. It went entirely over the kids' heads, 7 to 11-year-olds, and for hours after I was bugged with questions about why I laughed when Mother X said heavenly daddy. Jack worked at my last corporate gig. We were a manufacturing company, and Jack worked on the production floor. He was developmentally disabled, and so his job was to assemble tiny parts by screwing them together. He had his own work area, and he was happy with his 4-hour-a-day job. Jack was also very gregarious, and had zero filter between brain and mouth. The company is in Northern California, and we'd also hired about 10 or 12 guys of Hispanic descent. We had this tiny lunchroom that had 2 tables, 8 chairs, a soda machine and a candy machine and a microwave. I worked in the front office, a director, and was in the break room getting a soda when 2 of the Hispanic guys and Jack were eating their lunch. As I walked in, the 2 Hispanic guys were talking about how most of California used to belong to Mexico, and that Mexico should just take it back. At this moment, I'm inserting the coins into the machine and making my selection. Diet Coke. The machine rumbles and starts to dispense my canned beverage. As I bend down to get my drink, I hear Jack's chair scraping on the ground as he turns to these 2 guys and says, straight up, but we conquered you. I have never ever wanted the power of teleportation more than I did at that exact moment. I made a sound like someone trying to strangle a water buffalo and made haste for my office. Someone posted a similar question last week and this is what I responded. It fits well here too. My sister and I were pallbearers at my grandmother's funeral, meaning we spread the cloth pall over the casket. We did not carry the casket into the church. The church had a volunteer there to help direct us heathens that don't go to church and don't know what to do at a funeral. Right before we started, my mother gave me an Altoid. I had it in my mouth, but wasn't obviously sucking on it. As I was following the instructions of the volunteer, I inhaled and the Altoid went down the wrong pipe. I instantly started choking, making a high-pitched keening sound that the volunteer mistook for distraught sobbing. My sister knew exactly what was going on and just stood by and tried to hide her laughter, while the volunteer proceeded to hug me and tell me my grandmother was at peace and she wouldn't want me to be so upset. This went on for a few seconds and somehow my sister managed to spread the pall over the casket while I was being hugged by a stranger. I'm still choking as all of this is happening. The casket then gets pushed up the center aisle of the church by the volunteer that consoled me and some other men, with my sister and me behind them. I look desperately over at my sister and she just whacks my back as hard as she can. The smack was so loud it echoed through the church. So of course, everyone turns around to see what just made that noise, and they all catch sight of the regurgitated Altoid as it comes flying out of my mouth and lands not 1 inch from the feet of the volunteer that consoled me. My sister starts cracking up, and then ducks her head so no one would notice. I start cracking up, relieved that I can finally breathe again, and won't be joining my grandmother in the hereafter. And we look up, and my grandfather, who loved us dearly, but who was one of the sternest people alive, is beet red and looks like he wants to kill us. So of course we laugh even harder, and the volunteer still thinks we are hysterical crying, and shuffles us over to our parents, while the funeral mass begins, consoling us the whole time. It turns out my grandfather saw the whole thing, and was trying not to laugh. He told us afterwards that my grandmother would have found the entire situation hilarious. First, I have to tell you a bit about my great-granddad. He was a driver. A crazy, probably reckless, but very talented driver. He loved to faking drive. If you were driving anywhere with him, he was driving the whole way. Period. He'd also drive there very fast. The cops in his town knew him and didn't even bother to pull him over when he blew through town doing 70 plus in the 30 miles per hour zone. When his mother died, the hearse driver got lost. He was cussing, tailgating, and, eventually, overtook the hearse and led the way. He also loved his trucks. Chevy trucks, to be exact. He also loved classic country music. Never listened to anything else. Eventually, he got old and died. My mom had been his caretaker, and along with her mom, his daughter, and great-grandma, they planned his funeral. Well, his daughter, my grandmother, is special. She was mad at the planning because she didn't get to plan it the way she wanted. So, after leaving the funeral home, she called back and changed several things. One of which was adding a song to be played. Not one of his favorites. Nope. One of hers. Like a Rock by Bob Seger. She would later say this was because he was the rock of our family or some bullshit. Whatever. Somebody else she knew died, and it was played and everyone cried. She thought it'd get the same reaction. Well, funny thing about songs that aren't special to someone. Nobody cried. But lots of people remembered his love for Chevy trucks. And that the song had been in their commercials for years. The song came so far out of left field, and that memory just triggered it. My cousin and I buried our heads into each other's shoulders, and laughed so hard we were crying. So my friend decided to come out to me. Don't turn away yet. Let me add details to it, so I don't sound like a douche. I will start with the fact that I didn't fail holding the laughter. It was a Friday night. My friend/roommate brought 2 mutual friends. Then he went to dinner with them and didn't invite me. They eventually came back. I decided I wanted a drink, so I leave my room to go to the kitchen. As I'm doing that, I open my door and see my roommate sitting in front of our friend, both looking at me and both look intense. I drop the line of bad time. They say yes. So I turn around and get back to my room. I stayed thirsty all night, but I knew getting a drink is not worth walking around that intensity even for a couple of seconds. Next day, my roommate starts talking to me. Same intensity, same places they were sitting on yesterday, but this time it was me. I kept wondering what he needed to tell me. He gave me this long introduction, which was clearly for him not for me, explained how oppressive his family and that he was in the closet all the time, watching gay porn, and feeling bad about it, and then he dropped the information that he was gay. I look at him, straight up with just a smile of "I'm glad you told me, Jason. I hope you feel better." You might think, well, you handled that well. In my head I wanted to laugh. I just wanted to laugh over and over and over. I was gonna ask him to excuse me, so I can go to my room and just laugh. We never thought he would come out until he is in his 40s, looking at his wife saying, "Hey Karen, I think I might be gay." He was just very religious. The funny part is, the guy he was talking to before me, he knew since day one. He always kept telling us that my roommate is gay and that he is in the closet. Some people believed him, some didn't. In the end he was right. I personally think I failed because I wasn't supposed to think that was funny. You get to judge whether I failed or not.